For nearly a decade, the narrator settled into the rhythm of the small neighborhood pizza restaurant that had become more than a workplace. It was predictable in the best way: steady customers, familiar sounds, the same buzzing hum from the old ovens that had been repaired too many times to count. The shifts blended together not because they were boring, but because the routine felt dependable. Every morning meant wiping down the counters, checking the prep stations, and greeting the same coworkers who had become like distant relatives, the kind you didn't see outside of work but trusted in the kitchen. The old management understood the restaurant from the inside out. They followed the rule book not out of obligation but because they cared about how the business ran. The floors were mopped properly, the ingredients were stored correctly, and equipment was inspected before problems became disasters. They respected the longtime workers, valuing their experience and treating them like the backbone of the business. Even though the pay wasn't impressive, the environment brought a sense of comfort. It was a place where the narrator felt secure, knowing their hours were consistent and appreciated, but stability doesn't last forever, and everything began to shift the moment new management stepped through the doors. Their arrival was announced with the usual corporate optimism: fresh ideas, promises of smoother operations, and talk of boosting profits by making the restaurant more efficient. At first, this didn't sound threatening. It almost seemed exciting. But within days, the narrator realized those words were just a mask for something very different. Efficiency, as the new management defined it, meant stripping away everything that kept the restaurant stable. Training practices were ignored, long-standing procedures were replaced with shortcuts, and cost-saving became the new obsession. The narrator watched as cleaning duties were rushed, food prep standards were loosened, and supply orders were trimmed down until essentials barely lasted a full shift. The most unsettling change was the quiet removal of veteran employees. It began with subtle schedule adjustments. A worker who had always opened suddenly found themselves doing mid-shifts. Someone who normally worked weekends was assigned weekday mornings when business was slow. The narrator experienced the same shift in treatment, noticing hours shrinking just slightly at first, an hour or two shaved off here and there, but the pattern tightened quickly. Each week brought fewer shifts, and each schedule posted on the break room wall felt like a warning of what was coming. Management offered no explanations, avoided eye contact, and spoke in vague phrases that didn't answer anything. It was clear they saw longtime workers not as assets, but as obstacles to their new system. As the restaurant changed, the atmosphere shifted from familiar to unsettling. Tasks that once felt routine suddenly became stressful. The narrator found themselves walking into each shift unsure of what rule had changed overnight or what problem they would be forced to overlook. The place that had felt like a second home began turning into a place they barely recognized, and the slow erosion of their hours became the clearest sign of how quickly 9 years of loyalty could be pushed aside. At first, the narrator tried to stay calm. When the weekly schedule went up without their name on it, the natural assumption was that it had to be an oversight. Mistakes happened, especially during slower periods when hours were shuffled around. The narrator reminded themselves of past seasons when business dipped and a missed week didn't mean anything permanent. There was no reason yet to panic. But when the second schedule came out with the same glaring absence, the feeling of unease grew heavier. It no longer looked like a simple scheduling accident. Their coworkers, especially those who had also been around for years, started exchanging quiet glances, each trying to figure out whether the pattern they were seeing was real or just imagined. By the time the third week arrived, the truth was impossible to ignore. Their name wasn't there again, and neither were the names of several longtime employees who had once been dependable fixtures of the restaurant. Watching the shift from experience to inexperience was unsettling. Instead of seasoned workers who knew the menu, the cleaning checklist, the equipment quirks, and the safety rules by heart, the schedules filled up with new hires who barely understood basic procedures. They moved quickly but not carefully. They weren't taught the importance of food safety, proper sanitizing, or even the small details that kept everything running smoothly. Management seemed to prefer this. Inexperienced workers didn't point out problems, question orders, or report issues that should never have been ignored. They simply followed whatever cut corners management demanded, Even when it was clearly unsafe, the narrator tried to handle the situation properly. They reached out to HR, explaining the missing hours and noting the sudden disappearance of other longtime employees from the schedule. At first, there was hope and automated acknowledgement of the complaint, a reassurance that someone would look into it, but those messages led nowhere. Days passed without follow-up. When responses did come, they were vague and unhelpful, full of empty corporate language that avoided addressing the situation directly. It became obvious that HR wasn't interested in investigating anything that might reflect poorly on the new management. The system that was supposed to protect employees instead shielded the very people creating the problem. Each attempt to seek help felt like shouting into a void. Calls went unreturned, emails were ignored. And the only consistent pattern was the growing realization that HR's loyalty wasn't to the workers who kept the restaurant running, it was to the management team making the decisions. The narrator watched as their coworkers went through the same experience. Some tried to confront management directly. Others simply stopped showing up altogether, assuming they had been silently pushed out. The atmosphere became tense and uncertain, as though everyone was waiting for their name to vanish next. Meanwhile, the narrator felt the weight of 9 years of loyalty slowly slipping through their fingers. They had spent nearly a decade building a stable position, only to find themselves sidelined without explanation. The frustration grew, but underneath it was something colder and sharper, the sense that the restaurant was changing in ways far more dangerous than a disappearing schedule. Even so, it wasn't until the next series of events unfolded that the narrator fully understood just how deep the mismanagement ran and how much worse things were about to get as staffing changed. The restaurant's standards shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. Tasks that had once been handled with care were suddenly rushed or skipped altogether. Trash bags sat in bins long after closing, leaking onto the floor and drawing insects toward the back of the kitchen. The walk-in cooler, once tightly organized, became cluttered with unlabeled containers stacked haphazardly, some left open and others pushed into corners where no one bothered to check expiration dates. The narrator watched as the basic rules that kept food safe were treated as optional suggestions. Preventive pest control, which had always been a routine part of operations, stopped without warning. Management brushed off questions about it, claiming the service was too expensive and insisting it would be handled in-house. The first signs of trouble were small, almost too subtle to take seriously. A single roach skittering along the edge of a prep table, another appearing behind the soda machine. These incidents were unsettling but still easy to rationalize. A stray insect wasn't uncommon in a building that old. But within weeks, the sightings multiplied. It wasn't just one or two anymore. They were behind the ovens, crawling across crates of supplies, slipping out from under storage racks, and darting across the floor during busy prep times. Every new appearance served as a reminder that the infestation was growing and fast. The narrator's most disturbing discovery came during an evening cleanup. While refilling the cheese shakers used by customers, they noticed something moving inside one of the containers. The realization hit hard as they looked closer and saw roaches hiding beneath the grated lid, tucked into the cheese residue that clung to the sides. It wasn't just unsanitary. It was dangerous. Customers were unknowingly touching contaminated items every day, and the thought of families eating at tables covered with unseen pests created a sickening feeling that stayed with the narrator long after the shift ended. Naturally, each sighting was documented at least by the narrator, but none of the reports ever made it into official records. Every time the narrator approached management with proof, the response was always the same. The bosses dismissed the complaints, claiming the situation was under control or exaggerating the problem. They refused to file incident reports, closed off areas temporarily without explaining why, and used cheap store-bought sprays to mask deeper issues. These makeshift solutions did nothing to address the root of the infestation, and often made the problems worse by driving the roaches into new hiding places throughout the restaurant. The narrator began to understand something far more troubling than the presence of pests. Management wasn't simply neglecting responsibilities. They were actively covering up the infestation. Admitting the truth would mean inspections, fines, and possibly closures, things the new bosses weren't willing to risk. They valued their image more than the health of customers or the safety of staff. Worse, they made it clear that any employee who continued raising concerns would be labeled difficult or disposable. The narrator sensed that pushing the issue too hard could lead to being fired, just like the others who had suddenly vanished from the schedule. It became clear that the infestation wasn't the only thing hidden in the restaurant. Underneath the surface, there was a growing sense of denial, negligence, and silent threats. And as the roaches continued to spread, so did the narrator's resolve. Something had to be done, and management had no intention of doing it. By the third week of being left off the schedule, the narrator's frustration had grown into something sharp and focused. The sting of being pushed aside after nearly a decade was painful enough, but watching the restaurant fall deeper into hazardous neglect turned that frustration into determination. It wasn't just about the lost hours anymore. It was about the unsafe conditions customers never saw, the roaches crawling through the kitchen, and the silence from every level of authority that should have cared. The narrator had followed the chain of command, submitted reports, reached out to HR, and waited for anyone to take responsibility. Instead, the issues were buried and the narrator was left feeling invisible. At that point, relying on internal systems no longer made sense. If those in charge chose to ignore the truth, then the narrator would bring the truth directly to someone who couldn't ignore it. The idea began gradually, forming in quiet moments when thinking back on every step management had taken to hide the infestation. Eventually, the narrator realized that the most effective place to take this problem wasn't HR or upper management. It was the city's Department of Health, an organization that didn't care about internal politics or the convenience of management. They cared about public safety. They cared about rules. They cared about things the restaurant had long stopped caring about. So the narrator sat down and began crafting a message. It wasn't rushed or emotional. It was detailed, factual, and organized. Everything was included. The exact corners where the roaches nested, the spots behind the ovens where droppings collected, the dusty gaps beneath the prep, tables where insects hid during the day, and the storage bins that had become hiding places at night. The narrator described the times when the infestation was at its worst, usually early in the morning before opening or after closing when the lights were first switched on. Even the methods management used to cover their tracks were listed, including the last-minute spraying, the temporary closure of rooms, and the refusal to document incidents. The narrator knew that if inspectors showed up without guidance, management would try to mask everything. But if inspectors arrived with a map, the truth couldn't be concealed. When the report was finally submitted, it was sent anonymously. This provided a layer of safety the narrator needed, especially knowing how quickly management retaliated against anyone who questioned their choices. The moment the message was sent, there was no turning back. A mix of fear and relief washed over the narrator. They had done something bold, something risky, but also something undeniably necessary. The fate of the restaurant now rested in the hands of people who would not hesitate to act. The days that followed stretched long and slow. Every morning felt heavy, filled with suspense. The narrator imagined inspectors walking through the doors, uncovering everything that had been ignored for months. There was an underlying sense of justice building beneath the anxiety, a quiet satisfaction in knowing the truth was finally heading toward people who would not overlook it. Waiting became its own emotional battle, but through it all, one thought remained steady. The restaurant was about to face the consequences it had been avoiding, and no amount of denial or shortcuts would stop what was coming. The inspectors arrived without warning early on a weekday morning, long before management had a chance to stage their usual attempts at hiding problems. Their timing was precise and deliberate, catching the restaurant in its most unfiltered state. As soon as they stepped inside, they moved with purpose, heading directly toward the areas the anonymous report had described. They opened storage bins, shifted equipment that rarely got moved, and examined corners that hadn't been cleaned in months. With every flashlight beam, new evidence surfaced: roaches scattering, droppings lining shelves, and food residue collecting behind appliances where shortcuts had replaced proper maintenance. Everything matched what the narrator had warned them about, leaving management stunned as their carefully hidden issues were laid bare in the harsh morning light. Inspectors worked methodically, documenting every violation. Each discovery seemed to deepen the silence in the building. Workers froze in place, unsure of what to do, while managers followed behind the inspectors with forced smiles and flimsy explanations. Excuses held no weight. The truth was clear, and the inspectors wrote down every detail with measured precision. By the time the walkthrough ended, the conclusion was unavoidable. The restaurant was no longer safe for employees or customers. Orders were given, paperwork was signed, and the decision was immediate. The restaurant was to be shut down on the spot. Bright-colored emergency notices were taped to the front doors, transforming the entrance into a display of public accountability. Passers-by slowed to read the bold lettering outlining health violations and contamination concerns. Loyal customers who had eaten there for years paused with disbelief, trying to reconcile their familiar hangout with the severity of the posted warnings. News traveled fast, and within hours the entire neighborhood knew that something serious had unfolded inside the once busy restaurant. The restaurant's rating was officially downgraded to a B, and this simple letter had enormous consequences. In the restaurant world, a lower health rating was more than an inconvenience. It was a stain that could take months, sometimes years, to erase. Corporate leadership reacted quickly. The local management team was removed, stripped of their authority and escorted out with the weight of their negligence following behind them. Even upper-level supervisors who had ignored earlier warnings were reprimanded or dismissed. Emails circulated across the chain. Meetings were scheduled. The fallout extended far beyond the walls of that single location. For the narrator, the closure brought a complicated mix of emotions. The lost hours were gone forever, and the frustration from those weeks still lingered. But there was a deeper satisfaction in watching justice unfold. The people who cut corners, neglected safety, and mistreated loyal employees had finally been held accountable. Their choices had consequences that could no longer be ignored, and the narrator's actions had played a critical role in revealing the truth. In the end, the restaurant's downfall became a lesson that management never expected. They had underestimated the very employees who kept